Okay, naive realism. And the question is, well, what is naive realism, right? Naive realism basically states that the properties of objects in the external world, right? The properties of objects in the external world are the properties of ideas, of our mental capacity, right? So it basically says, and I'll write this down, naive realism makes the claim that the properties of objects are the same as ideas. Right? The properties of objects are the same as the properties of our ideas, right? There is a relationship between the objects in the world and the ideas that I have, the ideas that are generated from those objects, and there's a correspondence, if you will. There's a relationship between the external world and the ideas that I have based on my perception of these objects. Okay. What ends up happening is that Descartes wants to make a refutation of this. He wants to say, listen, though this may seem to be the case that I am in defense of naive realism because I look at the things in the world and they create objects within my mind, Descartes actually wants to say that would be an incorrect interpretation of my philosophy, right? So what Descartes wants to do is he wants to augment, he wants to change, he wants to add, he wants to transform this idea of naive realism, right? Though, and we'll see why in a second. The reason being is that we recognize that, remember, Descartes, as a rationalist, is trying to arrive at the truth, right? And if he's trying to arrive at the truth, and we recognize that he uses reason to access the truth of reality, well, as part of my mental faculties, these ideas, if I can misperceive an object, right? So I think that this object has a particular shape, a particular substance, a particular form. If I can misperceive it, then my idea will reflect that misperception. So one of the problems with naive realism, argues Descartes, one of the problems with naive realism, though it's not a direct critique, right? One of the problems with naive realism is that if it is the case that there's this direct sort of one-to-one relationship between the objects in the world and the ideas that I have of these objects, then a misperception of the object, right? A misperception of the object will necessarily result in an incorrect formulation of this idea. My ideas won't be correct, right? My ideas will be wrong. Why? Because I've misperceived the object. And this is what Descartes is attempting to avoid, right? What he does in order to critique this, as I've just said, is that he, and I've said it earlier, he looks at the act of misperception, right? He looks at the act of illusions, which I said also, right? And through misperception and illusions, he recognizes that this idea of naive realism can actually lead not to truth but to falsity, right? If you are not properly perceiving the world, then it might lead to false claims. But not only if you incorrectly perceive the world, Descartes takes it a step further, right? Descartes says that we actually have an inability, right? He goes further and says that we have an inability to properly perceive the world. Because how are we going to verify those claims, right? If I have an idea and that idea, argues the naive realist, is a consequence of the objects that I see in the world, then the only method for me to check my ideas against are the things that gave me the idea to begin with, right? It becomes sort of redundant. So Descartes thinks that, look, though naive realism was a useful tool, he wants to give a better tool to arrive at absolute certainty because he recognizes that misperception and illusion can lead to some problems. Okay, so what we're going to end up doing is we're going to see how Descartes addresses the idea of radical doubt, how he uses the process of radical doubt or methodological skepticism to actually arrive at the truth, what that truth is, and since we recognize that he's going to be reducing all of the properties that he sees around him to one essential property that he knows indubitably, right? One essential property that he knows with absolute certainty, he's then going to have to reconstruct the world after he's made this reduction. So we'll see sort of this two-phase approach to accessing the truth. Okay. Now with that said, let's see what Descartes does. Alright, so the first thing that we end up doing in this process of methodological skepticism, I'm actually going to change my... the first thing that he ends up doing, let me just change this marker. Descartes begins by critiquing everything that he sees in the external world, right? He begins with this critique of the external world, but it's not so much a direct critique on the existence of external things, right? He's not going so far as to say there is no external world, right? He doesn't make that leap. Other idealists will make that leap, right? But he doesn't make that leap. What Descartes does is he doubts how effective our senses are in accessing the truth, right? Because what might taste sweet to me might not to someone else. What might taste too hot to me might not to someone else, right? And this might be relatively true, right? That this is sweet, this is hot, this is too cold, but it's not universally true, and that is problematic because that's what he's trying to arrive at, right? Not relative truth, not subjective truth, but absolute truth. So the first thing that he does in this process, and actually that green is, well, that's fine. The first thing that he does in this process is that he doubts the senses. Right? He doubts the body. He doubts the body, right? The first thing that he does is he doubts the body. He doubts whether or not, as we've seen through the act of illusions and misperception, whether or not the body is an effective tool in accessing the truth, right? Whether or not, if we are directing the body into the world, we actually have an effective means of accessing the truth. And what Descartes does is actually pretty interesting, right? He creates this very, very interesting argument that we're about to go through now in order to assess how effective the body is for accessing truth. So the second thing that Descartes uses is he creates this dream argument, right? He creates this dream argument, and obviously everybody's heard of the evil genie, the mal genie, evil, right? He creates this argument for the evil genie, right? And basically, this is how the argument goes, just roughly, right? The argument says, imagine that, using our mental faculty, using our reason, imagine that there was an all-powerful, all-malicious, evil genie, right? And this evil genie had the power to deceive us of everything. He had the power to even deceive us of the truths of mathematics. Right? He had the power, and his power was so deep that he could actually deceive us of the truths of mathematics. Right? The genie could tell us that, 2 plus 2 really doesn't equal 4. And we would be able to believe that 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4. Because every time we take two objects, and we take two objects, and we go to count them, he can use his powers, and I would look and I would see, there were 5 objects, right? And what happens with the evil genie is that I don't have a means of accessing the truth because he's manipulating my reason, right? He's manipulating my reason. So that I could actually now, this process of radical doubt, and this is obviously the process of radical doubt, right? Through this process of radical doubt, we ask ourselves, well, what about this idea that we could be perpetually dreaming? Obviously, the movie The Matrix was sort of based on this principle, right? The idea that how can I make a distinction between the dream world and the real world, because the sensations are similar, right? I have a sense that I'm immersed in a world, but it's not until I wake up, it's not until something else distracts me that I recognize I was only in the dream world. Well, what if there was this dream world, and the person who ran the dream world was the evil genie, right? And the evil genie was perpetually occupying himself with completely deceiving me of all of the truths of reality.